All right, Thomas Paine. Interesting fellow. The two things that we read from Thomas Paine actually come from different points in the continuum for, in terms of time period at the beginning of the American Revolution. The first one, which is Common Sense, was a pamphlet which was distributed to the American colonies at large before the Revolution, providing 7 major arguments for why the American Revolution should be engaged in and was in fact justified. Whereas the Crisis 1 and Crisis 2, Return of the Crisis, was published during the actual Revolutionary War, and they have two very, very different goals in mind. The Common Sense is supposed to provide the logos, rational, philosophical, moral foundations for splitting with England. So it's very much appealing to people's logical side. It's not particularly inspiring, it's a little dense, but it's very sort of like point by point, case by case, claim grounds warrant case for why we should separate. Whereas the Crisis and the following pamphlets are directed towards not the colonies at large, but the actual American troops who are going through a very rough time. The colonial troops under Washington, they're cold. They've been defeated in battle a bunch of times. Some of their friends and family have been killed. They're demoralized. And so the goal of the Crisis is not to lay out a rational foundation, but it's actually to appeal to people's pathos. To say, hey guys, come on, let's fight. Let's continue doing what we're doing. He's trying to call them towards their sort of original love, their first love, which is we got into this battle because we believe strongly in the rightness of our cause, so we shouldn't stop fighting simply because it's hard. Good things are worth fighting for. Let's talk about Common Sense first, because this is the one that's kind of least approachable because it's a little dense. Thomas Paine was a big believer in the ideas of the Enlightenment and the concept of natural law. Remember that the Puritans and many of the other people before the Puritans based their logic and their sense of truth off of two origins. One, whatever they believed was in the scripture, and two, whatever they believed was traditional. So according to these sense of logos, the correct governmental structure, what was right for a government, was monarchy. Because monarchies, the king is very traditional, and it also reflects the kind of authority that God has in the Bible. So we know, going back all the way to King David, kings are pretty normal. At this time period, kings were very normal. They were the only game in town. England and France and places in Africa, everyone has a king, because it's just assumed that kingship, that a monarchy is sort of the natural, normal way of doing things. So that's the traditional aspect of things. The sort of scriptural aspect of things is the idea that if we look at how God orders and structures the universe, he is the supreme leader of all that is. Therefore, if God has absolute control over his subjects, then it's okay for a king to have absolute control over his subjects, because the king is sort of the earthly representation of God. You see the logic there? We should have a society that looks like the way God put it together. One person in charge, everyone else following with absolute devotion. But Thomas Paine is a different kind of thinker. He's actually almost avant-garde in terms of how he proposes we do things. And for that reason, he was actually rejected for a lot of his ideas. He died penniless. 6 people came to his funeral, all of them freed slaves, which is odd because he provided all the ideological foundation for our founding fathers, and today we look at him as being sort of a hero of American thought. But at the time, he wasn't liked. He was rejected for his thoughts because they were too edgy, too pushy, too beyond what people would expect. So let's lay out the foundation for what he's arguing for in Common Sense. He argues a lot of things outside of the excerpt that we read. For example, he argues that it's ridiculous for an island to rule a continent in perpetuity. He says it's ridiculous for Americans to think of themselves as being British because they haven't been British for a very long time. He says that we should not be part of Britain because Britain keeps getting embroiled in these slap fights in Europe, whereas America is so far separated that the longer we become connected to Great Britain, the more we're going to get pulled into European slap fights. And an example that he uses is the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War, in which honestly America had very little to do with it. It was France versus Great Britain fighting it out on American soil. So there's a lot of reasons why he feels like it is common sense for us not to be part of Britain. But the one that we look at today is the idea that it is common sense for America to be ruled not by a king, but by a representative democracy. Essentially, his thesis is this: democracy is better than royalty, or democracy, not royalty. Monarchy, thank you. Yeah, democracy is better than monarchy. Now today, with our sort of American ethos in our belief in right and wrong, we're like, well, duh, obviously democracy is better. But that wasn't the case back then. Nobody had tried democracy since the Athenians. And even the Athenians had sort of a form of oligarchical democracy, meaning the rich and powerful had a vote and nobody else. So really the concept of democracy and its benefits was it was a kind of a new thought. So he has to lay out the actual logical framework for why democracy is good and right, and why monarchy is actually not moral, which is hefty. If you believe that monarchy is the best reflection of God's authority on earth, to argue that monarchy is not moral is a pretty scary proposition, because essentially you're saying what you believe about God is wrong. But that's another thing we know about Paine. There's two things about Paine that really made him a radical. First of all was his insistence on rationality over sort of religion and tradition. And secondly, he was an abolitionist. Way before his time, he believed that slaves were wrong, like that slavery itself as an institution was evil and wrong, which became that was pretty radical in the 1830s. In the 1740s and 50s, it was phenomenally radical because everyone owned slaves, including, by the way, Thomas Jefferson. All right, so let's talk about his actual rational thought. His thesis is democracy is better than monarchy. Why? Well, both are forms of government. So you have to figure out, okay, if you're making the case that democracy is better than monarchy, you have to have some kind of a criteria. What do we mean by better? Right? Good, bad, better, worse, how do we know? His criteria is which one is more natural. Because if you believe that natural law is the way that we decide or divine truth, then whichever one is more natural must be more truthful, must be more right, must be better. So he takes a look at the types of government. He says, okay, governments, what are they for? Governments are instituted among men. Governments are for society. They are for the ruling and management of society. Define society as just groupings of people, right? You don't need a government unless you have groups of people, because they have no one to rule. So then you have to ask the question, okay, if governments are for people or for societies, then why are societies formed in the first place? What type of society is most natural? So he breaks it down even again. He goes from government to society, from society to the individual. He says, okay, let's talk about the natural individual. Let's boil it all down to the most natural state of being, the individual alone in the wild. That individual is free, is natural. There is nothing artificial about just a human being alone in the wild, because no one gets to tell them what to do. They get to make whatever decision they want. Hey, I want to make my camp here. I want to drink from this stream. I want to sleep at this time, wake up at this time. I want to shoot an arrow at this. No one is telling that person to do. No government, no society, nobody has a hold on this person's decision-making process. So they are free, and they are natural because they're close to nature. So that is the ideal. Perfect world, each one of us is 100% free. But there are some downsides. It's not an ideal world. It is a real world. And so he acknowledges that the aloneness, that the individuality of the sort of loner in the wild has some downsides. There's two major downsides. First of all, when you're all by yourself, you cannot accomplish all the goals that you have. So sure, you're free to say, I will make my home right here, but then you can't actually build the home on your own because you're only one person. You're not strong enough. You might not be able to cut down the tree, and if you do, you might not be able to make the tools to make the house. You can't lift it, you can't build it, you can't, and if you do make a house, it's very, very small. Maybe you want a larger house, but you can't, because you're only one person. So that's kind of the flaw of the individual in the wild. Yes, he's natural and free, but also he cannot fully realize his or her goals. Also, another disadvantage of the individual in the wild, although absolutely free, is that they are vulnerable. Meaning, if you're cutting down the tree and it falls on your foot, you're done, right? Because even if you can get out from underneath it, the foot's broken, you can't heal yourself, you can't go out and find food, you starve to death in the wild. That sucks. So what he's saying is that another reason why people gravitate towards communities and give up a part of their freedom is because there is safety in numbers. So that is his conclusion. One of his subclaims is that societies form to further the interests and goals of the individual and to protect the individual from harm. But again, it's all focused on the individual, the individual, the individual. But he recognizes that this is a transactional process. We give up a little bit of our freedom when we choose to live around others. Make sense? But what we get in return is more opportunity to accomplish our goals and more safety. But what do we do now? We have a group of people in the wild now. Not just one person, a group of people. 10 people in the wild, and now they can actually put together the cabin, and if someone breaks their leg, the other people will feed them and help them out until they get better, so you have all the benefits. But anytime you get 10 people together, decisions have to be made, right? Where do we build the cabin now? Where do we get food? When are we going to do it? When are we going to sleep? When are we going to wake up? So this is kind of one of the downfalls of community is now you have to consult with everybody else to accomplish your goals. So he says, okay, what's the best, most egalitarian way of living together in society and getting benefits of each other while not sacrificing too much of our freedom? It's democracy. If you have 10 people together, every single one of them should have an equal say in what goes on. Yes, you're giving up some of your independence, but at least your voice is heard, your will is manifest, and still the basic foundational goal of society is to protect and to enable. You still are protected and you are enabled by your vote. So it's like that's the ideal society, is that we are together, but we each get a say. But the problem here is that if we're all accomplishing our goals, we build a cabin, we start having families, we have enough of a food source. Now children come along and the population expands and expands and expands. Suddenly you have 20 cabins in the woods and you have 600 people. Well, no longer can you call together the 600 people for a meeting and say, okay guys, these people want to build their cabin, where are we going to put it, 600 votes. The problem with that is, first of all, you have to find a time where all 600 people can get together, which is just practically inconvenient. And secondly, you have 600 people in a room, you're going to have a ton of different opinions. And there's going to be fractiousness, and you can't really come to a conclusion, right? So his case is, okay, if societies are there to further the goals of its people and to support them and protect them, but you have so many people that these goals cannot be met, then the only possible response to this is something called a representative democracy. Not a pure democracy, like the 10 people all voting, but a representative democracy, which means there's one person that represents 60 people at a time, which means there's still 10 people making decisions, but they represent the interests of the other 600. And what he's showing is how, if we understand what the individual needs and what societies are for, then the government which represents those societies must have the same goals in mind. The same goals which we have for building societies must also motivate the building of governments. If societies are there to protect its members and enable its members, then governments should also be there to protect its members and enable its members. But he could foresee a situation in which those two goals are no longer being met. So what can happen in a representative democracy is that the people representing you become so separated from your interests, they become disconnected from the society that they're supposed to be representing, that no longer are your goals being furthered, which is, again, one of the two things society is even for. So if you have a government which no longer represents the interests of its members and furthers their goals, then it is a bad government. Also, one of the other reasons why we have society is to protect its members. If you have a government which no longer protects its members, which creates policies which are dangerous for its members or cause harm to its members, then he also says that's a fundamental violation of the goal of government, and that is a bad government as well. So logically speaking, we're back up to the top. If you look at representative democracy versus monarchy, his case is, because we understand what society is for in the first place, which is to protect and motivate the individual, a representative democracy in which people are elected constantly and are very close to their constituencies fulfills the natural goals of society. It is natural, it is good, and it aligns perfectly with what we know about humans. The monarchy is exactly the opposite. Because if you think about what the goal of a monarchy is, it is to further the goals of the rulers, not the society or the individual, and it is to protect the rulers, not the society. And we know this because if you are a vassal or a subject of the king, you have to pay money to him, you have to swear fealty to him, and you have to go to war for him. These are all things which communicate the fundamental fact of monarchy, which is that you are there for his benefit, not he is there for your benefit. It's backwards. And he argues that because monarchy is exactly contrary towards natural law, and representative democracy is exactly in line with natural law, then we have the right, we have the responsibility to throw off such a government and institute new bonds for our future security. The whole justification for the Declaration of Independence, the idea that whenever any government becomes abusive of these rights, it's our right to throw it off, is fundamentally aligned, was inspired by the work of Thomas Paine, which you just read. Without Thomas Paine, there would be no Jefferson. There would be no Declaration of Independence. There would be no representative constitutional democracy. There would be no 1787. There would be nothing. So, this is why logic, inductive logic, this is why claim, grounds, and warrants is so important. Because if you just assume, oh, democracy is good because it's good, you won't really understand that he had to think through this and justify, using logic, why democracy is a superior form. Because it no longer appeals to the tradition, it appeals to natural law. and that's